Franchi Talks Japanese Art. I'm Franchi and I'm back with a new video. Today's video is inspired by a book I bought a few months ago already. It's called Understanding Japanese Buddhist Statuary Through Visual Comparison, and it was written by Yoshihiro Suzuki. While I was reading this book, I fell in love with it because the author gives his own approach to understanding Buddhist Japanese sculpture. What he thinks is that a lot of times people tend to simply glance at Buddhist sculpture, but they have difficulties in truly seeing it. So he gives a set of ideas and advices of what we can do when we are in front of Buddhist statuaries to truly see it and hopefully truly understand it. So I thought, after reading the book and trying to understand all the steps, of course I didn't become a Buddhist statuary expert just by reading it, but I did my best. And I thought that I could try to find an exemplar of Buddhist sculpture that I could see in real life to try and apply the approach of Yoshihiro Suzuki to the sculpture. And I thought, well, let's also make a video out of it. So here we go. If this sounds interesting to you and you also want to learn a little bit about the approach and see how I try to put it in practice, stick around and let's jump right in. The statues that I selected for this video are two beautiful guardian statues which are in the collection of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. They are placed in the Asian pavilion of the museum. Originally, they came from Iwayaji, a location in Japan in the island of Shikoku. The statues were placed in a temple of Iwayaji, where they of course defended and guarded the temple. The legend tells that the temple was founded by a monk, Gyoji, and legendarily the statues were also commissioned by this monk. However, it is more probable that the statues were commissioned towards the end of the 13th century or the beginning of the 14th century, when the temple was experiencing a period of prosperity. These two guardians are called Agyō and Ungyō, and their role in the temple of Iwayaji was to be placed in a gate just outside the temple, and they were there to defend and guard, of course, the temple itself. And not only, but their role was also to be guardians in general of the Buddhist doctrine, so to defend it from all kinds of evil. The curator of Japanese art of the Rijksmuseum, Menofitsky, has also written a little booklet about the guardians, and in it he also tries to dive a little bit deeper into their role. So he goes a little bit beyond the idea of the guardians as guarding, but he also connects them to their symbolic meanings which are tied to Shingon Buddhism. In fact, the two guardians are connected to this esoteric school of Buddhist doctrine. This connection to Shingon Buddhism is also symbolized in the weapon that the two guardians are holding, which is a Vaira. The Vaira symbolically stands for the wisdom and the knowledge that is as hard and indestructible as a diamond. And also the shape of the Vaira carries symbolic meanings. For example, in this case you can see that at each end it only has one point, and this symbolizes how everything is one. One end represents Buddha, while the other end represents all living creatures, and in a way it symbolizes how these are two manifestations of the same living phenomenon. More symbolical meanings tied to Shingon Buddhism can be seen in their facial expressions. Agyō has his mouth open and he is making with it a sound A, while Ungyō has his mouth closed and he is making with his mouth the sound These are two sounds that belong to the Siddham script used traditionally to write Sanskrit text about Buddhism, and they are specifically the first and the last sound of this script. So they encompass all possible sounds all possible things. And sounds play a big role in Shingon Buddhism because it is believed that there are three categories of action: one vocal, one spiritual, and one physical. And by acting in these three different categories, believers can reach Buddhahood, they can realize their own enlightenment. So, sounds do play a big role in Shingon Buddhism. We mentioned that it is believable or possible that the statues were sculpted around the beginning of the 14th century, and this is also due to some stylistic characteristic which we can see in the sculptures. In fact, the story of guardians in Japanese art sees a lot of developments. The guardian statues were originated on the continent, and we can see the first examples of this sculptural subject in China around the 6th century. And then we find the first ones in Japan around the 7th century. In the 8th century, the main ideal to be achieved by the sculptures when representing guardians was dynamism and naturalistic bodies. However, um later on during the 9th century, there was more focus on some stylized depictions. But in the 12th century, we see a kind of a throwback to the style of the 8th century, with the focus being natural, realistic bodies, yet powerful and dynamic. And the sculptures that we are looking at today, they seem to be placed on the tail end of this development of this style. So we can see them as powerful, dynamic, yet well proportioned and somewhat realistic in their bodies. So let's observe them in detail and try to apply the approach by Yoshihiro Suzuki to achieve what he calls truly seeing. And we were gonna do this through a small series of steps. As first step, let's look at the statues as a whole, stepping a little bit backwards and taking note of their proportions and poses. The statues are standing frontally in a very powerful pose. They mirror each other's movement. Something that we need to take note of when we look at the proportions is that the arms seem pretty long, as well as the torsos, while the legs, although they are well proportioned, they still seem a little bit stout. And this was done on purpose because normally the statues would have been elevated in a temple gate, so the viewer would have had a different point of view from ours. And in that original location where they were meant to be placed, when seen a little bit from below, the long arms and torsos and the shorter legs would balance each other out thanks to the idea or the principle of reverse perspective, and so the effect would have been different at the time. As a second step, we can observe the statues from the side, and by looking at them from the side, we can take note of two elements: the sculptural space that they occupy and their volume. And Yoshihiro Suzuki always advises, whenever possible, to look at statues from each possible angle. Of course, this can be difficult, especially if in our case they're placed against a wall, but we can do our best. Looking at a statue's sculptural space, we can see that they are rather flat, as in they don't extend any limbs in front or at the back, and they tend to stand pretty straight. This is, of course, also tied to their original placement because they would have been placed in a temple gate, so the viewer would have only been able to see them from the front, and there was really almost no reason for them to extend at the back or at the front. However, when we look at them from the side, we can also take note, as we mentioned, of the volume. And we can see that these guardians are really thick. They have big, thick torsos. We can also see a little bit of bulge at the back, especially their upper back where their shoulders are due to their musculature. And we can also take note of how their flesh is, and it's really tight. There's almost no flab, but not almost, there's just no flab at all, which is of course makes sense due to their strong musculature. The third element that we should take into consideration, looking again at the statue a little bit as a whole, is the idea of movement. And we can see that these statues, they express a lot of movement with their bodies. As we mentioned, they're standing with mirrored poses. Their weight of their body is being bared by the straight leg, while the other leg is extended to the side. We can note also that the torsos seem to express a kind of tensions as if they were also turned, and the tension is expressed throughout the whole body in the musculature. For example, we see that both of the guardians are holding the vaira, and the way that they are holding it is not passive, they're not just simply holding it like this, but it's held with strength. We can see even the veins popping on their hands. And this same idea is expressed throughout their body. Every muscle seems to be tense, as if they are ready to move, ready to fight. The statue is not in movement, as in they're not stepping forward or backwards or anything, but there is this kind of sense of static dynamicity where every muscle is tense and ready to move. And the next step is that of looking at the robes of the statues, but in a way it's also connected to the one of movement, at least in our case, or in this case, because the robes, they're swaying between the legs and curving at the hips, they are also used to depict movement. One other thing to note about the robes is that they're really thick, so they do not leave any idea of the body parts that are covered by the robe. They give the idea of a very thick material. The next step to follow is to go a little bit more in detail onto the faces and the facial expressions. In our case, we already talked about facial expressions in the beginning of the video when I introduced the statues, and we said that they are Agyō and Ungyō are making specific sounds with their mouths with symbolical meanings. So we'll not repeat that. However, we can in general look at the face and facial expressions that are of course really angry guardians. They are meant to scare away evil, to defend Buddhist doctrine from evil. So of course they have to have a certain anger and scary qualities to their face. We can see that in general this sculpture decided to go for some heavy, strong features such as a large nose, strong cheekbones, really defined from the rest of the face, and also a very strong brow bone, which also gives a kind of aura of intimidation. And now I think that we have looked at every single step. I think that we have a better understanding of the sculptures in general, and some details may even be more impressed in our minds. And I'm sure that applying this method can give us a better understanding, a better way of seeing and recalling the sculpture than just glancing at them generally without knowing what to aim for. And then Yoshihiro Suzuki considers or advises one last step, which is whenever we are looking at a certain type of sculpture, to try to recall with our mind other sculptures that we have already seen, especially depicting the same subject, and making a kind of visual comparison to better understand the characteristics and the uniqueness of each sculpture, and of course the style of their makers or the time in which they were made. So we can make just a small comparison with the two most important or most well-known sculptures of Unkei and Agyō in Japan, which are the ones placed at the Todaiji by Unkei and Kaikei. Comparing the two statues to the two masterpieces by Unkei and Kaikei, it's not easy, but we can see that the Rijksmuseum and Iwayaji, let's say, statues and the Todaiji ones, they seem to belong to the same stylistic wave, although of course the ones from the Todaiji came earlier and they're the best exemplars of this style. However, the Iwayaji statues defend themselves pretty well, let's say. One noticeable difference is, in my opinion, in the robes, because the Todaiji statues, they have an extreme movement in the robes. They really express dynamicity and they flow all around their body. And they're, let's say, a little bit more elaborate in the rendition of the textile. And also, the guardians from the Todaiji seem to be wearing more jewelry. When it comes to their bodies, they also, the Todaiji statues, they present this kind of stout proportions, but again, they are explained in the same way as the ones we just looked at, that they would have been placed in a gate, so the point of view would have been different, with a different final effect when seen by the people going to the temple. A few differences in the faces. It seems to me that the Todaiji statues are a little bit, the features seem to be less strong, the cheekbones are less strong, or the brow bone, but their expression seems more severe to me, a little bit more intimidating. So this was the last step for this video. I hope that you had fun looking at the Ungyō and Agyō with me today. I think they are remarkable pieces of art, and guardians are always beloved by everyone because of the power that they convey in their bodies and their faces. They're hard not to love. And I hope you enjoyed the video. If you found it interesting or helpful, you can subscribe to the channel to see more videos in the future. You can also choose to send a donation to support the channel. There's a link for my Ko-Fi page in the description box. And if you want to stay in touch, you can write me a comment or follow me on Facebook or Instagram. It's always fun. All the links are again in the description. But for now, I just hope to see you again soon. Bye!